I call myself a front-end developer. Okay, so even still with front-end development, and my talk is about front-end development, it's still not clear what I'm talking about. So, does that mean HTML and CSS? Yeah, I think everyone can agree on that, but does it mean like JavaScript frameworks, or do I work in Python, or like, I know when I go to conferences and I speak to people and I ask them what do you do, and they say, I'm a web developer, you just start saying words to them and see if they nod, you go kind of like Angular? Kind of just have to still figure out what that means. So what I'm talking about today is really front-end development. So I'm talking about CSS, I'm talking about HTML, I'm talking about content, performance in the browser, I'm talking about creating really good experiences for the end user. Okay, so I need to kind of define what I mean by front-end development so you have an idea of what I'm talking about for the rest here. So I'm going to outline some best practices for the front end and talk about integrating that into Terminalfour. So, what are we talking about today? We're going to talk about design systems, typography and web fonts, using CSS preprocessors. I'm going to talk about performance briefly. I know Roundhouse said everything I was going to say, so means we get to drink soon, which is great. I'm going to talk about images and the modern web. I'm going to take questions, comments, and I'll take your reviews as well. So, to start off, I just want to say, I'm not suggesting this is the only way you should do things. I'm not suggesting this is correct and everything else is wrong. And if you disagree with me, that's actually really cool, and come and speak to me, and I'd love to have a chat with you about it, okay? So, let's start off with design systems. So, basically, when you start off your project, start with a design system in mind. Okay, so what do I mean when I say design systems? Well, here's a definition of a design system. A design system is a definition of the architecture, content, visual and supporting assets and templates to produce and to sustain a consistent and effective product experience. Oh, my God. I understand those words individually, I suppose, but you put them together like that and it's a bit all over the place. Mark Otto from GitHub, the way he describes it is everything that makes up your product or your site. Okay, so that's a design system. So Mark Otto, if you don't know of him, he works at GitHub now as a designer. He's previously at Twitter, and he's the creator of Bootstrap, which I know many of you use. So, everything. Yeah, I mean typography, layout and grid system, colors, icons, components, coding conventions, voice and tone, style guides, everything. That's your design system. So have all of this in mind before you start your project. Basically, a design system is a model by which you catalog and define your design into its building blocks. Alright, that's your design system. So, it allows you to maintain organization and maintainability. So organization, like working with messy code bases, is a stuff of nightmares, and it keeps you awake at night, okay? Having this defined makes the messiness far less likely. And over time, new developers will be joining the project to fix bugs and add features. Proper guidelines and conventions allow people to do things correctly, okay? It gives you the ability to have an overview of your project. Having a design system in place, it allows you to see at a glance the kind of a bigger picture without needing to see an entire website. Effectively, it's like creating a tiny bootstrap for every site, right? So your site should have its own tiny bootstrap. And most importantly, really, it's this idea of designing for modules and not designing pages. So there's hundreds of ways to do this. There's so many ways to implement a design system. None of them are more correct than any other. Today I'm just going to talk about one kind of system that I like to use in PS and we tend to carry over because I think it fits particularly well with the way Terminalfour CMS works. So it's called Atomic Design, and the way it works is you've got atoms, molecules, and organisms. So follow along with me for this metaphor, and I think it should make sense by the time I get to the end of it. So we start with atoms. Okay, so atoms are the smallest level building blocks, as in chemistry. Okay, they can't be broken down without losing their meaning any further, right? For example, these are the raw HTML elements on your site, right? So you might have a button. Okay, that's what it is. We call this an atom, right? You might have a label, or you could have an input box, right? So these are the atoms, and you design these individually. And then you put them together, you put your atoms together, and you have molecules, right? So molecules are groups of atoms bonded together which take on new properties as a result, just as in chemistry. Okay? So groups of elements function together as a unit. So you put all those previous atoms together, and now you've got a search form. All right? Next up, you've got organisms. So groups of molecules and possibly even atoms join together to form distinct sections of an interface. So in this case, we have a logo, and we have navigation, and we have our search form. So it can consist of kind of similar or disparate molecule types, right? So for an example here, we have the logo and the navigation and a search one, but you could have an organism of many of the same molecules. For example, an events listing, right? So you'd have a single event on its own, and you put them all together, and you have the kind of events listing organism. So it's basically just a way of thinking about your design from the beginning and how you're going to put it all together. Terminalfour was built for this. It really was. So molecules and organisms are your content types. All right, and the best way to work in Terminalfour, in my opinion, is to have fewer page layouts and more content types. You want this to be as modular as possible. Okay, you want to have these building blocks that you can put together and reuse in any way you want, and have a consistent look and feel. Okay, you're no longer designing pages; you're designing the building blocks for those pages. You don't need many page layouts. You just need to be able to drop your organisms together and create new templates. Okay? If you start your process with kind of this approach, it makes working in Terminalfour much neater and a cleaner experience. Okay? So that's all I'll say about design systems. I could go on forever, and if you want to talk to me about it further, please do. Next up, I'm going to talk about typography and web fonts. So I'm a bit of a type nerd. I'm the person in Terminalfour that has like a big stack of books on typography, and I made poor Sean read a book on typography the other day. And that's me, okay? So I think it's really important. I think it's all about good type, okay? So choosing a good typeface is something I really recommend. And here's some things to consider when building in Terminalfour, okay? Your content is the most important part of your site. And I think everybody says that content is king. It's all about your content. And we spend a lot of time thinking about our content. But what font you use defines how you're expressing that content. That's what I believe. Okay, so if the words you put on the site are your voice, okay, then the typography is the tone of that voice. I think it's really important, and I think good typography is one of those things that when you see it, you know like something's right, but when it's bad, you know something's wrong, even if you don't quite know why, right? People, I think, recognize bad type, even if they don't know that it's bad type they're recognizing, they just think something looks a bit wrong here. And good type, people notice. I think it's really important. So there's a few ways you can use web fonts. There's lots of services out there. Here's a couple of specific things about using them in Terminalfour that you should probably keep in mind, okay? So Typekit is a service, very popular. I know Roundhouse used it for Chagas because they were talking about Chagas that they were using. They used it there, and it's great. It's a web font service, and it can be called asynchronously. Your fonts load in nicely. There's a couple of things to consider, and this is not just typical with Typekit, but with most font services, you can have kind of one of two things. It's FOUT or FOIT. What that means is like you can either have a flash of unstyled text, okay, or a flash of invisible text. So when you load the site first, you can either not show any text while the font is downloading, and then when it downloads, then you can load in that font and show all your type. That's called a flash of invisible text because there's nothing there, right? Or you can have the flash of unstyled text, where it's kind of the system font on page load until that font is brought down, and then it throws in the right font. And that's the flash of unstyled text. So there's no right or wrong way to do it. Once it's downloaded once, you can do some smart things with caching to reduce the problem going forward. But it's something you should really consider. If you use Preview in Terminalfour and your CMS server doesn't have access to the internet, this becomes a serious issue. It takes 3-4 seconds before the font call times out, and then you eventually can see your text. So keep that in mind. If the people who are going to be creating your content are going to be using Preview a lot, and just think, does our CMS server have internet access? Have access to these services? And if not, are you creating a crappy experience for your content creators? Because that's not great. So just something to keep in mind. The other option is Google Fonts. Here's another couple of things to just keep in mind with Google Fonts. Again, the same preview issues that I mentioned. Also, there's this thing that happens with Google Fonts, and with all font services actually, really, how you're calling them in. So if your CMS server is on over HTTPS, and you're referencing the Google Fonts with HTTP, you're going to get weird errors. It's not a real problem, but users can see that and think, oh, something's gone wrong with my website and I don't know what it is, and can I trust this site? My browser says something's wrong here. So just make sure you either just always reference HTTPS, or you use protocol relative URLs, which is just take off the HTTP colon part and just use // and it will use whatever protocol you're on at the moment. Okay. There's also this really weird, and it's a really kind of, you would think it's an uncommon thing, but we get it all the time in PS, okay? And that's, one other thing I just want to mention actually, Google Fonts don't support all font features. So although a font on Google may have ligatures, the fonts that they actually serve you don't often contain all of these additional font features. So keep that in mind if you're using Google Fonts as well. But this other one I really want to talk about, it's a really weird use case, but I swear we get this one all the time in PS. So if you're using rem units in your CSS, and if this is going over people's head, that's okay, I'll go past it quickly. And a lot of people use rem units who are using Foundation as a framework, because it uses rem units. Rem units don't work in IE8. So there's a bit of JavaScript you can use to kind of make it work, okay? If you are using rem units and you're using that JavaScript, Google Fonts just breaks, right? Not only does Google Font break, that bit of JavaScript that fixes your rem units kind of falls over as well, and your site looks like horrible on IE8. And it can be really hard to debug. There is a workaround, so if you've ever experienced this, and I know people do, because we see it all the time, come and speak to me about it. Okay, so that's it for fonts. I won't bore you any longer on it. Next up, I'm going to just talk about using CSS preprocessors. So, before I continue, how many people out there are web developers? Yeah, a good number of you, great. How many of you are front-end web developers? Most of the same people, great. And how many of you use CSS preprocessors? All of you, yeah, that's what I thought, okay. So, what's a CSS preprocessor for those who don't know? It's basically an extension on CSS. The browser can't use it, but it compiles down to CSS. So what it is CSS lacked features, it was showing its age, it was missing features that people wanted, like variables and loops and the ability to nest things and so on. So there was things like less and Sass were created, which allowed people to write the CSS the way they wanted, and then it would compile out to something that's usable in a browser. So it makes your developing really easy. And then it spits out the CSS and you can use it in a browser. It's great. Really good, and we recommend it. So this is how it works. So this is some Sass. It looks kind of similar to CSS. Here I've just got a variable at the top where I have to find a color, and then I've got a link, and I give it that variable there, and then there's also some nice functions in there, so I can, on my hover text, I can lighten that link by 20%, for example, okay? And then I compile that and it spits out something like this. So you'll see the color is now what I wanted, and the hover color is a different color. So that's great. And CSS preprocessors are incredible tools. I don't know any front-end developers that could develop without them these days. Terminalfour doesn't support them out of the box as of yet. Now, I've talked to R&D, and it's something that we are looking at going forward, okay? But at the moment, it doesn't support it out of the box, which means you have to put your CSS into the media library and reference that, okay? There's always going to be a case where people need to go and continue development in the future, which means they have to edit that CSS that was created from Sass, which if any of you have tried to do that, it's often really difficult because often people don't write their Sass very well. Okay, so you've got to think of what's called the Sass inception rule, which is, as you saw earlier, you can nest things. So we've nested the hover inside the anchor here, and you can see how that outputs. You can nest like as deep as you want, but you shouldn't, because the CSS it creates is horrible, and it's really it's hard to maintain, and it's slow in the browser, and it's just something to be aware of. So they recommend don't go 4 layers deep, more than 4 layers deep in Sass. I say never go past 3 layers. And Sass has this function to allow you to extend kind of stuff that you've built already. So if you've defined a class to look a certain way, you can extend that. I just say don't use extend, because it just creates horrible markup that just is very difficult to maintain the CSS for. Okay, so it makes it like really impossible to work in CSS. So has anyone seen Ryanair's new website? Yeah? Okay, so it's really nice compared to their old website. It's like, it's a huge step in the right direction. The Ryanair website is gorgeous, and it's much better than it was. In the usability standpoint, it's a lot better, but it's really slow. It's a lot slower than it used to be. Okay, it's really, really slow. And the reason for that, believe it or not, is their CSS, right? That's playing a huge part in it. They've got a really large DOM, and their CSS rules are so complex that even modern browsers just can't keep up, okay? So there's some really interesting articles on Medium where people were kind of looking into this and just checking the size of the stuff that's coming through on the Ryanair website. Their main CSS file, it comes down to 300 kilobytes, which is not very big, right? That's gzipped. But when you uncompress that, it's 3 megabytes of CSS. 3 megabytes of CSS. That's like the original Doom game is less than 3 megabytes, and that's got 27 levels, and it's like there's a lot more in it than the Ryanair website, right? Just the CSS, it's incredible, and it's so complex. And if you look at the CSS that it's output, it's gross. So just be really careful when you're using Sass not to overdo it and go too deep and extend all over the place, because for 2 reasons. It causes things to slow down, and 2, it's actually really difficult to maintain, because you no longer have access to your Sass files. You're working with the compiled CSS now once it's in Terminalfour. So that's it on CSS preprocessors. Next up is performance, and I'll just quickly fly through this because I know Roundhouse talked about this in more detail earlier on. So we crossed an impressive milestone this year. Average web pages have crossed the 2 megabyte mark. Isn't that wonderful? That's almost twice as much as it was 3 years ago, and it's mainly images, and that's a big problem, and we've talked about why already. Okay, so more people are connecting with mobile devices. You can't, assume people have good internet connection. Google favors performance in their search results. That's something to keep in mind. And we've heard all these reasons before earlier, so I'll keep going. There's a few things that I would keep in mind when developing for Terminalfour. That's this year. Use performance budgets. Limit the number of requests you make. make sure your images are optimized, and that's a big one. Minify everything you can. I know that can be tough in Terminalfour if you're going to continually update your CSS and stuff. It's really difficult to work with. Minimize. Enable gzip on the server, obviously. And when you're developing and you're doing your testing, test for slow devices. Chrome allows you to throttle. In the inspector, you can actually simulate a slow connection and see what it's like to load your site on a slow connection, and that really should be a part of your development cycle. So Terminalfour can help out. You can use the image broker and auto variants to kind of crop down larger images. That's something you can definitely do, and there's some work we need to do to make the quality of those images better, and that's something we'll work on going forward. But that's something to keep in mind. There's definitely stuff you can do programmatically to make images better. But I'm going to talk about images specifically now, and images on the modern web. So, images got confusing. It used to be an image tag, and then there was a source, and you put the path to the image in, you put in some alt text, and there's your image. It's wonderful. HTML5 introduced, extended on the spec, and it introduced both source set and picture elements, and source sets and attributes, and then there was a new element, and how is that all supposed to work? So we get delivered a lot of designs from different agencies. Some people get it, and then some people just don't seem to get it. They don't know how to use these new elements. So I'll just go over quickly on how they should be used. And it's safe to use them now. They have really good fallback for all the browsers, so don't shy away from them. Just make sure you're using them correctly. So I'm going to talk about source set versus picture and what the difference is. So source set is an attribute on the old image tag. Okay, and what it does is it allows you to let the browser decide what image to use. All right, so here's an example of an image tag using source set. So like before, I have source and I've given it a source file. And then I use source set, which is this new attribute, and I give it a couple of different images. I'm giving it a large image and a small image. And then I'm giving it a width definition with the W to say, browser, you decide, if you're over this, if you're at this width, use this image, and if you're at this width, use this image. And the sizes attribute just lets you tell the browser, how big is this image going to be on the final site? Is it going to? So we've said it's going to be the full width. This is going to be a big banner image. So this lets the browser decide, and it can make decisions based on kind of the quality of the network and lots of other things. So this is not to be used if the browser chooses the wrong image. It's bad, right? So don't use it if the browser is to make a different assumption to what you think, that it would result in the page rendering in an incorrect way. So basically, it should only be used for when the aspect ratio between the two images that you're defining here is the same. Okay? Images always have the same aspect ratios, then use source set. Then there's the picture element, which also uses the source set attribute, but a bit differently. Okay? So it's a whole new element within HTML, and the user decides what image to use in the picture element. Okay? So here's an example of a picture element. I've got a picture, and then I've got two sources, and then I've got this image with a source and the alt text as a kind of fallback. And that means you can use this in now. Okay, and old browsers will fall back and use that image element, and it's fine. Okay, but what you're doing here is you're defining your media to say at this width use this image, and at this width the first one use a large image, at this second width use a medium image, and if you don't know what that means, you use a small image. Okay, so that means you can let the user make art direction choices. And that's when you use the picture element. So that means if you've got a slider, for example, and it's not very tall, but on mobile you want to go to a more square image, you use the picture element. Okay, so in this example, in the picture element, images don't need to be the same aspect ratios. Okay, so what can Terminalfour do to help here? You can automatically create images, like I said before, with the image broker, and that can be used for source set within the image tag for optimization reasons. And we can, as I said, we can improve that image broker to make better quality images. You can use auto variants and programmable layouts to make that work. And I think Gillian, if you're interested in how that works, speak to Gillian. She's the master on that. So when it comes to the picture element, you have to let the users choose 2 or more images. That's just how that works. I'm sure there are ways you can programmatically crop images and stuff, but just let the users make art direction choices and everyone's happier. Okay, so that's everything I'm going through. So in summary, I've talked about design systems, I've talked about typography and web fonts, why typography is important and why you need to invest time and type. I've talked about using CSS preprocessors. I've just scratched the surface of performance. We've talked about images and how to use the modern image tools in HTML. Now questions?